Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. And it's my joy to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. David Hurd, who is one of the leading musicians in the Episcopal Church. He currently serves as the Director of Music at our neighboring parish, Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Times Square. Before joining St. Mary's, he taught for 40 years at General Theological Seminary, and he is a composer whose hymns and choral anthems have been sung all over the Episcopal Church, including at St. Bart's. We're also glad to be joined for this conversation by our own organist and choir master, Dr. Paolo Bordignon. Good to have you both with us this morning. I should mention to all of you watching that this conversation was recorded in advance, so unusually this morning we will be unable to answer your questions during the forum. Dr. Hurd, it's so great to have you with us.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
So let's start by talking about how you first became interested in church music. How did you hear the call, so to speak?
Well, the first live music I really ever heard as a child was in church. And I was immediately captivated by the sound of the organ and the feel of the organ in the floor and in the pew, and the sound of the choir. And I loved the pageantry, and it was really the whole thing. As a small child, those were major outings on Sunday, to go to this big place with brightly colored windows and the smell of incense and the whole business. And so the organ and the choir were very important aspects of that experience. And I thought, I want to do this.
And so how did you take those first steps? When did you start the organ? When did you start working with choirs, that type of thing?
Well, the first steps was, as a small child at the end of the service, running over to the organ console at the end of every service to watch the postlude, and just sort of being completely captivated by the machine there, But I began piano lessons as soon as it was practical to do so. When I was about 6 years old, I started piano lessons, and there had been music in my family, a lot, not professional music per se, but lots of avocational music, and all of my father's sisters played the piano, and my mother played the piano, and the pianos in my grandparents' house were always being played by somebody when we were there. And so that was an important formational kind of thing. And so I wanted to play the piano also. And so I began piano lessons with a private teacher when I was 6 years old. And my father was very eager for me to get the best instructions. And so when I was 9, he urged me to audition for the Juilliard School preparatory division. And so, but of course, at that age, the organ was not available to me because my feet wouldn't reach the pedals. But as soon as I was at the Juilliard, I saw organs there, and I thought, oh, I must rekindle my desire to play the organ. So we went to see Bronson Reagan, who was teaching in the preparatory division at that time. And he took one look at me and he said, "Come back when you've grown 6 inches." When you're 9 years old and someone says, "Come back when you grow 6 inches," that seems like it's going to be an eternity. But actually, it wasn't quite an eternity. By the time I was 12, he thought I was sufficiently tall to sit on the organ bench. So I started organ lessons when I was 12 at the Juilliard Prep.
And was singing a part of your musical background, either at home or in church? Or?
Oh yeah, I mean, as I said, I loved the singing from the time I was a small child, and as soon as it was possible for me to join a choir, by that time my family had moved to Queens, and our neighborhood church had a choir of boys and men, St. Gabriel's Church in Hollis. And so I sang in that choir under the direction of Lily Andujar Rogers. And we just, from age of 9, that was the age of admission to the boys' choir. And I sang in that choir through the age of 16. passing gradually from soprano to alto to tenor to bass during that time.
When did composition start?
Well, I always was fascinated by the idea of written music, and you know, again, the childhood impression of the little 3x5 hymnals that were hymnals in 1940 that had just the melody line at the top of the page and then the text. I was very fascinated by music notation. So when my first piano teacher was very keen on the basics of music theory. So at the very beginning, he had me buy a music writing tablet, and I filled the first page with amazing graphics, you know, just writing notes. But no, I was always very eager to write down music and to learn how to do that. And I like to improvise. I like to just sit at the piano and extemporize. And so you know, that the desire to create music was from the beginning.
So you went off to Oberlin and then you returned to New York. Did you always know you were gonna come back to New York and that New York would kind of be your lifelong base?
No, I mean, I had no particular sense of that. I mean, New York was home, and I loved New York. I mean, growing up in New York was a great boon. I mean, first of all, the music school, being able to attend the Juilliard School was a great gift. But also being in a city where, as a child, I could get on the bus or the subway, and I could, in high school when I couldn't drive, I could go to concerts every Sunday. And I went to Sunday afternoon concerts at St. Bart's, at St. Thomas, at Holy Trinity Lutheran, every place that was having, Riverside Church, every place that was having a concert. I even went to Evensong and Benediction from time to time at St. Mary the Virgin. And so I used to enjoy getting the times and looking to see who was doing what that afternoon. And as soon as I was finished with church on Sunday morning, I'd jump on the subway and come into Manhattan to hear some music. And so that was a great, so I love New York for all that it had to offer in that regard. And, but you know, when I went off to Oberlin, my thoughts were, we'll see what happens next. And it just happened to come back to New York to be Larry King's assistant at Trinity Wall Street.
And I know you also spent time at Intercession, at Holy Apostles. Right. Can you talk about the parishes you've been involved with over the years? Well,
yeah, when I graduated from Oberlin, I was obviously thinking of going to graduate school, but the position at Trinity Wall Street was open at that point, and I kind of thought, well, admissions to graduate schools happen every year, but jobs are only open when they're open. So I thought the opportunity to work with Larry King would have been really worth its weight in gold, and it was. Working under his direction, and in fact, he was a model to me at that time. Of course, this was in the early 70s when the liturgy, new liturgies were emerging and music was required for them. And he and Calvin Hampton was across town at Calvary, were writing music for these liturgies. And I kind of, that was very empowering and very inspiring to be in a place that new things were happening. And of course, Trinity could be on the cutting edge of new liturgy because if people didn't like it, they, you know, it didn't have an economic impact. And so Trinity could afford to really sort of model the new liturgies, and so that was a great education and a great opportunity and a great invitation, if you will, which of course was directly related to Larry's championing my coming back to New York after a year of teaching at Duke University to go to the Intercession, because they were obviously in the same liturgical transition to new rites and wanting new music, and so that's sort of that trajectory sort of began with with my work at Trinity. And curiously enough, when I went to the intercession, pretty soon they decided they wanted to have Rite 2 at the Sunday Mass, and I called Larry and I said, "Can we use your Mass setting for Rite 2, his people's music, which he had written just a couple of years before?" And he said, "Absolutely not." He said, "You need to write for your own congregation, and they need you to do that, and the church needs you to do that." And I kind of thought, wow, that's a real great teacher to say, no, you're not going to get out of this one. you have to engage your creative energies, and that too was very very empowering, and it was a very important moment in my life. After a few years at the intercession, the position at General Seminary opened, and one of the associate priests at the intercession, Victor Schramm, was a doctoral student at that time at General, and I had met Tom Talley, who was the liturgics professor, and the two of them conspired with me that I should be the music director at the seminary, and so they urged me to apply, and the rest is history. I went to the seminary in '76 as a very young instructor, and most seminarians spend 3 years at seminary, and I spent 13 times that. I was there for 39 years, and it was a rich experience.
What were those 39 years like? Can you talk about what it was like to arrive there as a young professor, and also what you saw happen over those 4 decades?
Well, in 1976, the church had just voted, the General Convention had just voted to respect the ordination of women to the priesthood. And so that was a real turning point at the seminary and in the Episcopal Church. And not only that, but the Book of Common Prayer was approved for its proposed 3 years use, its trial use. And so liturgically and demographically, the church really took a major leap at that moment. And the liturgical activities were front and center. And music along with them. So the direction of music in the chapel, and of course the life at General at that time was so anchored in daily worship and we sang the evening office 4 times a week. We sang the morning office twice a week. We sang at Eucharist at least 3 times a week. So there was so much opportunity for music, and so much demand, if you will, for new forms and for energizing the new texts. So there was an immediate call for composition and for, I hate to use the word experimentation, but to a certain extent, you know, when you're trying new things, you learn from that process. And just to experiment for the sake of experimentation, I think is a waste of time. But to actually be open to new possibilities and to learn from those which are fruitful and those which may be less fruitful, and then to go from there was a wonderful time.
David, did your opportunities then at General serve as a kind of laboratory for what eventually made its way into the wider repertoire, not only through the hymnal 1982, but through your own catalog of works?
I think so. I mean, it's you know, as I mentioned, you know, even from when I was working with Larry King, and then at the intercession, there was opportunity for new music, and there was the desire for that. But it really accelerated when I went to the seminary, and in 1976, I think as a result of my appointment at the seminary, I was invited to join the Standing Commission on Church Music that same year, and so beginning in 1977, my 9 years on the Standing Commission on Church Music began. And curiously enough, I mean, many years earlier, Ray Francis Brown, who had been professor of music at General for many decades, back from the early 30s until late 30s, until the time of his death in the 60s, Ray Francis Brown had been a key figure in the development of 1940 hymnal. And so it seemed really, of course, in 77, I was only vaguely aware that that a new hymnal was happening in the Episcopal Church, because the General Convention hadn't really officially authorized it at that point. But the commission had been gearing up for that process, and so it was really quite a wonderful opportunity for me to learn. When I was brought onto the commission, I was the kid on the block at the seminary, and I was the kid on the block in the music commission, and there were folks like Alec Whiten, like Jim Litton, who were the next generation of adults in the field. Some of whom I had met before, others I had not gotten to know, and then people from across the country. And so our meetings and the projects that were already underway, I gradually was incorporated into that action. I remember the first time we had a meeting at Sewanee at one point, where one of the supplements, Hymns 3, was just about to go to press, and they realized that there were a couple harmonizations short of what they needed. And we were sitting in Marion Hatchett's living room, and somehow the way the conversation went, the ball got thrown to me. Why don't you do the harmonization for X tune? And so in fact, the X tune was Resignation, which My Shepherd Will Supply My Need. And I did that harmonization in Marion Hatch's living room. And
David, for the benefit of our parishioners, I wonder if we might contextualize some of these folks we're talking about. Without going into their biographies, I would just in a general way say that yourself, Alec Whiten, Jim Litton, Marion Hatchett, Ray Glover, Richard Prue, the various people that worked on the hymnal 1982, we look back at that Standing Commission on Church Music and specifically the committee that worked on the hymnal, is a who's who of really the people who were shaping church music in America, and specifically within the Episcopal Church, given their various roles, which we won't go into specifically. It must have been an extraordinary thing for you to join that group, but also it must have been extraordinarily valuable for them to have you join, given that you were working with a younger generation, that you were ready to put in all of the work to create and to energize the new texts, but also that you had not only the laboratory of General, but your work before that at Intercession and other places as well, trying out new texts to see what took and what didn't.
Yes, well, I mean, it was, I mean, I think that having the seminary musicians involved in the process of the hymnal revision was critical. And I happened at that time to be the youngest of them, and in the seminary that probably had the most aggressive music program of all the Episcopal seminaries. We made a habit in the early years of the revision process of having meetings around the country, and we visited many of the seminaries and participated with them for a week, maybe, in their worship life, and had meetings with the seminarians and workshops with them. And we also visited religious communities Cowley, Holy Cross, St. Helena, various communities, and met with the religious folks and about their needs and their religious practices and their musical practices and their concerns about the development of liturgy. And so, yeah, the commission was intentionally national in its spread, a little bit ecumenical, and people like Richard Prue, who came from the Roman Catholic Church, but of course also was very familiar and had worked in the Episcopal Church considerably. You know, and there was an age spread as well. I was the bottom end of that for a while, and probably I think pretty much to the end of the time. People like Bruce Nesbitt came on later on and sort of displaced me as the youngest member.
Thanks to a letter that I have from Jim Litton here in the Music Archive, he mentioned that after that national process of visiting all those communities, which sounds like a wealth of riches to be used by the committee to formulate the hymnal, that in fact the finalizing process was hosted here at St. Bartholomew's in the choir room. And so I also have a guest book with your signature in it and with the signature of this extraordinary collection of people that served the process. And it's amazing to me to think that our rehearsals with the choir happened in the space that helped foster that process. It's an extraordinary thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, in the late part of the process, there were so many records that needed to be kept, and they were kept at the church offices at Church Hymnal Corporation, and so we met at St. Bart's in the accommodating atmosphere there, and on a few occasions sort of drifted out into the church to play on the organ a little bit. And yeah, it was wonderful to have that, and in our meetings in New York also, sometimes we were able to draw on the other musicians in New York. People like Vernon Datar at Ascension would come and join us for lunch or for various parts of our meetings, or we'd have dinner together, that sort of thing. But
was one of your teachers at Juilliard?
Datar?
Yeah.
Actually, no, I never studied with Vernon. He was my examiner. Since Bronson Reagan was my teacher, I had to play my juries for Dr. Datar, and he was very, very kind and lovely, and I was very glad to get to know him as an adult, and we became quite friendly in his later years.
I wonder if I might ask you about one tune in the hymnal 1982, and Peter, I will let you sort of moderate the discussion and guide however much time we have and don't. But when you mentioned the name of your first choir director in Queens, I did hear the middle name Andujar, which is of course a hymn tune that we in fact just sang this Christmas. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about whatever you might like to tell us about that tune and its benefits and the homage in the name to your choir director.
Yeah. Well, Lily Andujar Rogers was a marvelous woman, fine musician. She was a pianist out of Peabody, and then she studied organ and became a really very distinguished organist. And I think at the time that she passed the FAGO exam, she received the highest honor. That was before it was called the Elmer Award, I think. but she distinguished herself. She taught at the Guillemot Organ School when it was in its heyday. And so she came to St. Gabriel's as music director back in like 1959 or something like that. And so I heard her play the organ from the time that I was a small child, and she was an impeccable player. I mean, I just never was a wrong note anywhere. And a very fine pianist and a meticulous organist. And I never studied with her privately, but she answered my questions. I mean, Mrs. Rogers, what is this? What is that on the organ? And she would explain all these things to me, and she would every now and then let me play the organ a little bit at the end of choir rehearsal. Anyhow, it happened that I was when the commission was working through the hymnal texts that had not already, had fixed associations with music. There was a lot of interest in A Stable Lamp is Lighted, Richard Wilbur's text. I was pretty uninterested in Christmas texts at that time because I was working at the seminary and not in a parish. And so I didn't do Christmas. and I thought, well, there's already so much Christmas music. We really, but the more members of the commission sort of wrung their hands over not finding the right tune for Richard Wilbur's text, I began to look at the text and I was really captivated by it and thought, well, I should try this out. And so I did try it out, and it seemed to me it needed something like a ballad because there's a narrative in the text that goes through mood changes, and somehow a ballad type of music that could sing through this transition from the stable to Calvary and then back to the stable again. That sort of a ballad song was a style that seemed to work, and a sort of pianistic accompaniment seemed to come, and I thought Lily would play this beautifully. Because in choir rehearsals she didn't just bang out the notes; she played beautifully, and she taught us with her voice and taught us by the way she played the piano how to phrase and whatever. And so I thought I have to name this for her, and I was very glad that she was very glad I did, so it's. But she's one of my heroes and one of my mentors.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. I did not know that background behind what is a favorite of mine and certainly a favorite of this parish. Thank you.
So you can correct me, David, if I'm wrong, but I think I counted that you've contributed to 29 hymns in the hymnal 1982. Some of those are accompaniments, but many of those are original tunes. And you contributed a lot more even to the service music. I think I noticed that the only composer who's made more contributions than you did was Vaughan Williams. Again, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. So clearly the hymnal committee realized the talent they were working with. Can you talk about what it was like to write so many new hymn tunes and what it's been like over the years to see so many parishes take them on and adopt them as their own?
Well, I have to say that the commission evaluated a lot of submissions. A lot of music came in, and everything that was submitted was evaluated anonymously. And so now, until the very end of the process, where there were a few loose ends and blank spaces that needed to be filled in hurriedly, and in that case, certain people were delegated certain responsibilities. But for the most part, most of the decisions on submitted music were handled anonymously, and so we had fun with that to some extent because this is in the day before they were people did computer engraving. So we received hand manuscripts of. In fact, there was one particular composer who sent 88 tunes to us because there were 88 texts that didn't have partners for music, and we sent those texts out to certain composers, and this particular composer wrote all 88, and we could tell his handwriting. It was the same handwriting. We only found out later on who it was. But at any rate, over the course of time, there were some of us in the room, like Richard Prue, like Alec Whiten, like myself, whose handwritings became recognizable. But we were not allowed to reveal that we knew whose they were because the process was supposed to be anonymous. And you know, and I can recall a time when Marilyn Kaiser was at the piano and she played through a tune and she said, "Ray, you've got to tell us who wrote this." And he said, "Absolutely not until," you know, so so that was part of the fun of the whole thing. And as I said about Andujar, I wrote that largely because I sensed that the commission needed something, that the committee had already agreed on the specifications of what it wanted, but no one had written it. And so I sort of had the inside edge in a way, because I knew what they were looking for. And so then when I submitted, it was submitted anonymously, but I sort of knew what some of the biases of the committee was in terms of the kind of music they were looking for, and in fact I learned a lot about reading hymn texts from those conversations, and in terms of my own judgment of other people's work, of what really worked and what didn't really work, and there were a couple other things, like for example. The mass setting, a New Plain Song, which happened very curiously, because again we were looking for a setting that would be for Rite 2 comparable to what Marbach is for Rite 1, and we didn't come across such a thing, and so the committee constantly said, well, we need like another Marbach, but only for Rite 2. And David Farr, who was on the commission at that time, said, well, why don't we write the setting, because we know what we're looking for. And so he came up with a motive, and he said, why don't we just take an afternoon, and we were meeting at Virginia Seminary that day, and each one of us take a movement of the mass, and they assigned me the Gloria because it had the most words in it. And so, but various ones of us took a movement. And so we came back after a long siesta and shared our movements. And so we liked many of them, but the group decided, well, why don't we have one person bring it all together and you know, write the mass? And since the Gloria was the biggest movement and had the most notes in it, they said, well, why don't you just take your Gloria and base the rest of the service on that? And so that was an assignment that went to me, but it came back to the commission for approval. And
I'm so glad that of the many contributions to the hymnal that you mentioned, that one, we are in fact starting our seasonal setting of the Mass beginning this Sunday will in fact be your new plain song. So our congregation will hear that every Sunday for several weeks, beginning this week.
I'm glad to know that. I mean, it's a very sort of humbling thing to know that music that I wrote has been embraced and is part of how people stand in the presence of God, and it's a very distinct honor, I think, to have been able to offer this and to have it accepted, and is a very wonderful feeling.
I think congregations and musicians, lay and Levites together, feel a certain gratitude towards you and towards all composers. I don't compose, and so I need your settings of these texts and your anthems and these words to form the words of my prayers to God. And so as a congregant and as a professional musician as well, there is I think an unspoken gratitude that goes with having the vehicle to express our prayers that you and people like you have provided. We should, Peter, probably listen to some of Dr. Hurd's concerted music as well as his choral music.
Yes. Do you want to talk at all before we go to some clips we have about your approach to choral music?
Well, my approach to choral music basically is that one wants to set a text, and one wants the text to sing. One wants the text to sing in a way that it is understood. and it's understood as more than just words, but with the full sort of cloak of expression that only music can give to words. And so my concern is singing, the natural use of the voice, and to provide a medium for people to use their voices. So it's interesting that most of my composition is choral. I'm very much driven by text. When I've been asked to write an instrumental piece, I find that more of a challenge in some respects. And in fact, in some instances, I've resorted to thinking of a text in order to prime the pump for composition.
Well, our first clip is from your piece, I Was Glad. Do you want to talk about that as I get ready to play it?
Yeah, this was a setting I was asked to write for the Cathedral of St. Paul in Des Moines, Iowa. And it's, that text, Psalm 122 is a fantastic text. And a lot of choirs aren't able to master Parry's glorious setting of that text. And so I wanted to write something that was available to choirs of more modest means, and but yet still had some of the splendor of what that psalm really is talking about.
Okay, here's the beginning of I Was Glad by David Hurd. I love that you mentioned Parry, because I've sung your piece several times, and I always wondered to what extent you were consciously thinking about Parry's setting of the same text.
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, that recording, I'm so grateful for that recording. Richard Tanner did that at Blackburn Cathedral. And so it really has the whole flavor of English cathedral. And so, yes, obviously, I think that some of the aura of the Parry setting was part of the inspiration, I think, behind this piece.
So the next excerpt is from In Honor of Martin. Do you want to talk about that piece?
Yeah, I mean, In Honor of Martin is one of the few intentionally secular pieces that I've written. It was based on, it was a setting of a poem. It was intended as an honor, in honor of Martin Luther King. And it was commissioned by Rejoice Ensemble under the direction of Carl Maltzby. Carl wanted a piece for vocal quintet, piano, string bass, and percussion, and set me free to find a text. And so I found Jamie McKenzie's text, Standing Tall, which is about the life of Martin Luther King. And but I surrounded it with this wisdom text, the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God. And so the first movement presents the wisdom text. And this is the first movement. Now, several years after the original piece, Malcolm Merriweather encouraged me to orchestrate the piece for full orchestra and choir. And he performed it with the Dessoff choirs at Tully Hall in 2016. And that was the premiere of this expanded version of the first movement, which with the text from Wisdom.
Great. This is the first movement of In Honor of Martin by David Hurd.
I might add that that performance was the Tully Hall premiere, but I think the second performance that was ever done of In Honor of Martin was in maybe 2006 or so at St. Bart's. Where Carl Maltzby conducted the original Rejoice Ensemble personnel.
Our final excerpt is actually the full piece, I Will Wash My Hands in Innocence. Would you like to introduce that?
Oh, yeah. This is just a little portion of Psalm 26. And I wrote this as an ordination gift for the Very Reverend Leighton Lee, who was back in the early 2000s, I believe, a seminarian at St. Bart's. He was a student seminarian. He graduated from General back in the early 2000s, and he is now Dean of the Cathedral of the Redeemer in Calgary, and this little portion of the psalm I wrote for his ordination to the priesthood.
I will
Such a lovely short piece I wasn't familiar with before. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you for playing it.
Who is singing on that recording? Do you recall?
That's basically the house choir of Oregon Catholic Press.
Wonderful, really wonderful. It's marvelous also to hear the range of those three pieces. I want to say just about the craft of the first. Of I Was Glad, that I think the listener would never realize your amazing sleight of hand, if I might call it that, in making such resplendent music any less challenging than the Perry. It's really an extraordinary piece of craft from you. Wonderful to hear that setting and that kind of text, and by contrast, well, each of the three very, very different from the other, and quite wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we are running out of time rapidly, but I wonder if I could ask you about my favorite piece of yours, which is Love Bade Me Welcome.
Oh my.
Talk a little bit about how that piece came to be.
Well, actually, that was, I call that a Saturday night special. One of the priests at All Saints Church, where I was director of music at that time, All Saints 60th Street, Charles W. Scott. Charles Scott was a really wonderful, wonderful guy, and he was celebrating his 40th anniversary of ordination. And I just sort of found out about that and thought that we ought to do something musical for him, because he was keen on church music and whatever. And I knew he was keen on George Herbert, and probably had even quoted Love 3 at some point in a sermon, maybe. And so I thought, why don't I set that, you know, and having a wonderful 9-voice professional choir, we could just sort of sight read something on Sunday morning. And so I wrote this little, you know, sort of strophic setting of the Herbert text, which is just such a superb text. And we all know it from the Vaughan Williams mystical songs, and one hardly wants to try to compete with that magnificent setting. But I didn't know a choral setting of it. And so I thought, well, this is an opportunity. So I decided, well, let's see what we can do in a short space of time with unaccompanied voices. And it was really quite a challenge, because the three stanzas are part of a dialogue, and it's a magnificent dialogue. And so while the meter lines up, the phrase structures don't necessarily line up. So it was really quite an interesting puzzle to try to make essentially the same music serve those three stanzas. And I'm very happy that the piece has achieved so much attention and been performed beautifully just by so many choirs over the years. I'm very humbled and pleased to know that the piece has gone out.
So can you talk about, as we end here, what your thoughts are on Anglican church music in general, especially in the Episcopal Church, as we enter a new era? There's talk of hymnal revision, etc. What are your hopes and your fears for the future of church music?
Well, I don't want to try to predict the future. I can certainly say that I feel very, very blessed to have been been involved in the process of getting to this point. I think that the hymnal 1982 was a forward-looking hymnal that respected the tradition, and it's now an old book. and so much new has happened since that book. I myself have composed a lot of music since that time. So many new authors have written magnificent hymn texts, and I just hope that going forward, those people who will be charged with that task of revising the hymnal will give the same care to the tradition that we were charged to do nearly 40 years ago, and at the same time have a kind of creative vision of where the church wants to be and how the church wants to sing its song for the next few decades. We're in such a different time now where technologically it's possible to be liberated from any book. And there's a great advantage in some respects, but also some danger to sort of lose that connection to the taproot, to lose that sense of a common tradition. And I think the Episcopal Church being sort of born out of the principle of common prayer, of liturgical texts that form us, and liturgical songs that form us. I think it's very important that we continue to be creative, but that we not lose that which we have in common and that which is our inheritance. And so that wonderful tension of being grounded in tradition and in common practice, and also free to experience the Spirit anew. That's about the summation of, I think, my thoughts about that matter.
Paolo, do you have any final questions for Dr. Hurd?
I have a million questions for Dr. Hurd, but I also have his email address and phone number.
Okay.
And I look forward to being able to ask you those questions when we can get together safely. At the risk of asking you the sort of question that requires a whole semester maybe to answer it, I don't know if it's that kind of question, but what is it like to be tasked with notating a spiritual, music from perhaps an oral tradition, in a way that puts it down on paper, at least in one form, for a church nationally? What's that like?
That's a hard question. That's really a hard question.
Sorry, if it's impossible, then that's okay. But
No, I think it's a very valid question. I think that in some ways, it's not any different from what is it like to do an accompaniment for a piece of plain song. You're, in a sense, trying to create a setting of something that is larger than any one setting. So what you do is you offer a thought. You offer a set of thoughts. I did accompaniments for 2 spirituals in the hymnal that I can recall. And in each case, I offer an interpretation. There are many possibilities, and so, but this is just my thought on the matter. And if it works, fine. I think about, for example, Winfred Douglass's classic harmonization of "Were You There?" that has just achieved, I think, I mean, because it's so beautiful, and it has become classic. And I want that harmonization, you see. And so I hope that maybe there'll be others, but at the same time, I think the great folk melodies, whether they be plain song, whether they be spirituals, etc., defy any one particular version and are open to interpretation, and that keeps them alive, I think.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there because folks have to head off to worship at 11 a.m. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning, David, and thank you for your music, which we continue to sing regularly at St. Bart's and in Episcopal churches all over the country.
Thank you for your kind invitation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all for watching. Please do join us for worship in just a few minutes.